Welcome back to the IEA's podcast, Everything Energy. I'm Dan Hewitt. This week, the petrochemicals pushing up oil consumption. Wherever you're listening to this podcast, whatever you're doing right now, many of the everyday things that surround you exist because of petrochemicals. From the earphones that you might be listening to this podcast on, the clothes you're wearing, your paper coffee cup, they're pretty hard to escape. Even if you know they all come from a barrel of oil, you might be surprised by the amount of global oil demand that goes into making them. Here to help unpack this link are two oil market analysts from the IEA. They'll break down what petrochemicals are, how they're produced, and the big trends shaping the sector today. We're going to start and finish with David Martin and also hear from Ciarán Healy. David and Ciarán, thanks so much for joining me. David, we're going to start with you, and I want you to begin by giving me a basic description of what petrochemicals are.
Well, petrochemicals is a catch-all phrase that covers a huge range of products. So you're absolutely right. They're in our daily lives. Generally, we think of them as products that are derived either from oil or from gas. They can be as simple as just packaging, plastics, but they can also be synthetic fibers. So it could just be, the clothes you wear. But look around you. You've got anything from pharmaceuticals to solvents to detergents. These are all products that are, in some ways, that have building blocks that trace back to the petrochemical sector.
And is it possible to think of any of us living our daily lives without coming into some sort of contact with petrochemicals, or is that incredibly difficult?
I certainly think in advanced economies, it's almost impossible not to have petrochemical-derived products in your daily life. I cycled to work this morning. I had a crash helmet on. That's made from petrochemicals in one sense. I had a waterproof jacket on. That's petrochemicals in another sense. So they are ubiquitous.
Let's just step back and think about how the world actually makes petrochemicals. So let's just start at the beginning. So when the oil arrives at the refinery, what state is it in? What's the first process of the refining?
These products are coming from oil and gas. Okay, hydrocarbons very generally are usually in a mixed form in some way or another. So crude, as it turns up in the refinery, needs to be processed. You need to take that mix and you need to fractionate it or separate it out and tweak and upgrade the products you don't want into products you do want. And so we try and think about how we go from a mixture of hydrocarbons into specific products. And those specific products can be used for transportation, so gasoline, diesel, jet fuel. Globally, we would say that covers about 2/3 of the oil use this year, roughly. But then you've got other products. You've got things like the lighter products like LPG, liquid petroleum gases. You've also got a bit of ethane. And then you've got things like naphtha, which are, once again, reasonably light. And these products, which aren't necessarily going into transportation fuels, can be used as feedstocks, so the building blocks of what we then process into or will get processed into petrochemicals.
So you mentioned naphtha earlier. So let's just go into a little bit more detail about what feedstocks are and some of the key ones, how they're made and how we use them.
The big three feedstocks that we tend to think of are naphtha, which is effectively a lot like gasoline, but also LPG, the liquid petroleum gases, so propane and butane, which we might use alternatively as like barbecue fuel, but also then ethane, so even lighter. And these oil streams, not particularly high value, but they are easily crackable into petrochemicals, so into ethylene primarily, but not exclusively. And depending on what you crack, influences what gets produced.
And just jumping in, and just to explain a bit more about what we mean when we say cracking.
If you heat oil up high enough, you'll get a physical reaction in the structure. So the molecules will break up, and you'll get new chemicals formed from those feedstocks.
And you mentioned your bicycle helmet at the top. So how does that come about? How can you get to the point of the cracking process you mentioned there to the point for the materials we use every day?
Okay, so the feedstocks are cracked into primarily things like ethylene, but also, the list is almost endless. But from there's always going to be another process that can take the molecules you've built and turn them into something else. And this is where the flexibility and the variability comes into, and the potential, for growth in the industry is that there's always more uses of products that you're trying to produce.
And I just want to ask you about natural gas liquids, because they're part of the picture as well. So How are they used and how are they related to the petrochemical sector?
The natural gas liquids are, as the name suggests, they are the liquids that are produced along with the natural gas. Okay, so you get a mixture of hydrocarbons coming out of the ground at, say, a gas field, and then you would fractionate, similar to the refinery but different, these very lighter products, light petroleum products, away from the natural gas. And then that would allow you to capture, once again, single streams of products, typically ethane, but also the LPGs, liquefied petroleum gases, and some heavier products like naphtha. We typically call that pentane plus, but it's essentially the same sort of building blocks. And so you've got an alternative source of supply for your feedstocks coming from NGLs.
When we look at the refining process, maybe it's useful to think of it in terms of getting as much value as you can from a barrel of oil. And by that I mean, on the one hand, you have lower value items like feedstocks, on the other, higher value products like jet fuel, but everything becomes something.
Absolutely. Refineries are very focused on how they can maximize their profits. And the beauty about the petrochemical integration with refining is that you can take some of the lower value product streams like naphtha, like LPG, so propane, and you can convert them into much higher value products. So when we think about naphtha, it trades at a significantly lower price than, say, gasoline. But actually, if you take the naphtha and you crack it, you can produce things like ethylene, which are much higher value. And indeed, the further down the value chain you go, and the further integrated you are, the more the opportunity to capture greater value is.
Okay, David, thanks so much for that. We're going to talk to you again at the end. Now let's bring in Ciarán. Ciarán, let's talk about the global picture. And I want to begin by asking you how much of global oil demand goes into producing petrochemicals.
So as David was saying, roughly 2/3 of oil demand in the world goes to produce the major fuels. And of the rest, about half is petrochemicals. So that's about 1/6 of all oil used today goes into making those plastics and fibers and so on. Total oil demand is about 100 million barrels a day, slightly more. So roughly 16, 17 million barrels a day of oil goes into petrochemical production.
And how has that trend changed over the recent decades? What have we seen? Have we seen petrochemicals taking up a larger share?
Yeah, maybe the most important thing about petrochemicals for the global industry is the way that they're growing. So if you look back to 2019 versus today, so back to the pre-pandemic level, almost all the growth, so a strong majority of the growth that we've seen in oil demand is for those petrochemical feedstock products. It's not necessarily that petrochemicals have an explosion of demand themselves. Really see quite steady growth in those products, increasing in line with GDP, with manufacturing, with people's demand for packaged products. But the growth rate of several other major products is slowing down. So as things like electric vehicles, more efficient cars, erode the demand for gasoline and diesel, the importance of petrochemicals is rising.
Okay, well, let's step back and have a look at the global picture. So where are petrochemicals being refined and produced today? And maybe you could tell us a bit about how some of the trends have changed over the last few decades, over the last few years.
So the single biggest trend of the last 5-10 years in petrochemical markets, as with so many other sectors in the energy space, is around the rise of China. So China has constructed an enormous wave of new capacities, mainly associated with its refining build-out. And these plants are equivalent to the whole of the capacity that previously existed in the traditional centers of naphtha cracking in the world. So places like Japan, Korea, Europe, you put all those together, China's added it over the last 5-10 years. So really an extraordinary speed, an unprecedented way. And that's reshaped the space. China's the most important producer of chemicals, the most important consumer, the most important importer, and one of the most important exporters, all at the same time. That's generally a refinery-associated model, but it also reflects some other trends. So one of the big things that's emerged since the pandemic is major flows of natural gas liquid-derived products from the US, especially propane, but also ethane, to supply Chinese chemical plants. This drive to get value from natural gas liquids has been very geographically specific in general. Because they're comparatively hard to move compared to some other feedstocks, it costs more to ship ethane or propane than it does to ship polyethylene or polypropylene, the plastics you end up making from them. So you tend to try and locate the production where the supply is. And that means that over the last decade or two, there have been really big expansions in the Middle East, where there were large volumes of underutilized feedstocks from oil production. So that's especially true for Saudi Arabia, that's had enormous success in building out a petrochemical industry domestically. And then subsequently in the United States, as the shale boom producing oil and gas with lots of natural gas liquids associated, that triggered a wave of massive plant expansion from about 2014, 2015 onwards.
Okay, now I want to talk a bit about the economics, the finance of the industry. So is it fair to say that oil and gas companies are betting on petrochemicals? And if so, why?
I think if you look at the strategy of so many of the big players in the industry today, that petrochemicals is at the center of it. So there's a huge amount of investment going on in the capacity to produce petrochemicals, in the configuration of new refineries to maximize the shares of some of those products and to get the full value for them. And I think the reason that's really important, the reason people are choosing to take that direction, is because of the demand trends we're seeing. That if you can't be sure about the demand for road fuels, petrochemicals is something you can take that bet on, as you say.
Now, when some people think about petrochemicals, perhaps they think about obvious things like plastic pollution. But are there any realistic alternatives about the way the petrochemicals can be produced in a more sustainable way?
So there are some different routes to get to plastics and fibers. The most important ones in terms of producing the same molecules or the same materials are other kinds of fossil fuels. So, for example, in China, coal to chemicals is a really important route. In some parts of the world, you see on a relatively small scale bio-based production routes. But it's hard for these to replicate the overall scale of the petrochemical industry just because it's tied to such a big overall industry. It might be more relevant to discuss some of the materials that do similar jobs. So if we think about fibers, for example, the polyester fiber that comes from oil is really competing with cotton. And the limitation in the ability to supply some of those things, like cotton or glass or aluminium cans, whatever it might be, this is part of the growth story for petrochemicals, that it's something that has been able to expand and produce more and more. And that's obviously led to some of the challenges that you mentioned in terms of disposal and waste management.
And what can you tell us about recycling? What sort of impact does that make? What percentage of the total pie does that make up today?
Recycling is one of those questions that really depends on how you define it in terms of the overall impact. What we can say with a reasonable degree of confidence is that it's a relatively small impact on the overall size of the pie. It's single-digit percentage. And in general, the things you produce using recycled plastic are not normally competing with things you produce from what we call virgin plastic, so from new plastic. The exceptions that might be in fibers, where recycled polyester, often from bottles, plays a really important role. But elsewhere, the impact is still relatively small on that upstream core industry. And I think our view is that this decade, at least, we don't expect the progress in recycling to be enough to slow the development of plastic demand and the demand for petrochemical feedstocks. I mean, in that way, it contrasts with something like gasoline, where you have this wide-scale electrification undermining demand. There's not really an equivalent on petrochemicals.
Now, I want to look ahead. So what's the percentage of oil demand that could come from petrochemicals next year, and then looking ahead to, for example, 2030?
So we think that the rate of increase in petrochemical demand will be important, but not spectacular. What really characterizes it, compared to the rest of the oil industry, is that it's still growing. So really there's only two major sectors of oil demand that still continue to grow at a significant rate, at least globally. One is petrochemicals, the other is jet fuel demand. We think that petrochemicals will contribute somewhere around 60%, 2/3 of the oil demand growth during the rest of this decade. And that will see the share rise from about 16% to about 17.5%. Sounds small, and it emphasizes how gradual this process is. What's important about that is that it's something that you would expect to carry on for the foreseeable future. Right? In the absence of alternative at a major scale or a real change in how consumption takes place around the world, this is something that will continue to grow, and maybe as other things recede, become increasingly important.
Okay, so we know that there's going to be a growing demand for petrochemicals, but what could that mean for emissions?
So the important thing about petrochemicals and emissions is that normally you don't burn them. So with a fuel, with gasoline, with diesel, that's the demand for that is directly translated into an increase in emissions. For petrochemicals, it's not the case. So as we see demand for those other pieces slowing down, but petrochemicals continuing, that means that the growth in emissions from oil slows slightly faster than the overall growth in oil demand. And we'd expect, well, both of those things, but we'd expect the emissions piece in particular to plateau during this decade and for really that growth on a net global basis to come to an end.
Okay, and while we're looking at forecasts, David, I just want to return to you. So what do we think could happen into the refining sector in the future? So let's just think about where in the world it's happening now, but where it could potentially shift to.
Okay, so when we look out to the end of this decade, so when we think about the report we published in the summer, Oil 2025, it's clear that as petrochemicals become a more important part of the overall demand mix, there's a push by refiners, notably in places like China, to be ever more integrated with the petrochemical operations. Okay, now that in itself is a bit of a conundrum, because we've already said that these are low value products that you can upgrade into much higher value products, and in a sense you're actually building refineries to produce more of that lower value because you want to be building world scale petrochemical plants adjacent to large refining operations. And then the integrated margin across both those segments is better than the prospect of actually having a refinery, which, yes, it produces gasoline and diesel and jet fuel, but the outlook for demand for those products is questionable over the next 25 years. So there's a sense that refiners are trying to align themselves more closely to petrochemicals to give themselves a more sustainable runway in terms of the demand.
And lastly, we know that petrochemicals are going to play a big role in the driving of oil demand growth in the future. But what could be some of the consequences on the refinery sector? Are we expecting expansions, or could we be expecting some contractions in parts of the world as well?
So when we look at the refining industry globally, what's clear is that some regions will prosper. And here we're thinking about Asia, but also the Middle East. But, the demand drivers regionally are going to be places like India, Southeast Asia. And there, refineries in those markets, refineries supplying those markets, have a pretty decent outlook for demand for their products. Conversely, markets such as Europe, but also parts of the US, notably the West Coast, are under a lot of pressure, both from contracting demand, but also high costs. And refining, and arguably petrochemicals, is a brutally competitive industry. Very standardized technologies. So really it comes down to how much you're paying to access your energy costs. And we see places like Europe as a disadvantage to producers, or refiners rather, in the Middle East or in Asia who have access to cheaper energy sources.
Okay, well, David Martin and Ciarán Healy, thanks very much for your time.
Pleasure.
Thanks.